If you're watching this video, it's probably safe to assume you've either seen or at least heard about writer-director Ryan Coogler's latest movie, Sinners. But depending on who you are, you might not know that the hype around it goes beyond it just being a good movie. Coogler's been a significant creative in the black community for years now, making movies about black people depicting us not as victims or statistics or stereotypes, but more as artists, visionaries, or even superheroes. For black folks who had just come through the era of black pain films, which we've already talked about, to see ourselves with agency on screen in a movie for our folks, by our folks, showcasing the best and proudest parts of our culture, it was beyond special, and if you were there, you know. Ironically, if you recall, Coogler, along with his frequent accomplices Michael B. Jordan and Ludwig Göransson, made one of the most infamous movies of the black pain era, but I'd say they've more than made up for it now. Naturally, everybody in the black community's been online talking about their takes on the movie, its messages, and how they personally connected to it, and that's all been really cool to see. So now, after getting back from seeing it a second time and fighting off seasonal allergies and a head cold, I decided I wanted to pitch in on the conversation. And from a perspective I'm really well versed in, Black American music and its connections to the diaspora. Now, for anybody who hasn't seen the movie, I'm issuing a spoiler warning immediately because it's impossible to talk about what we're going to talk about without getting into spoilers. But for those who have and are familiar with what we do on this channel, I bet this video doesn't surprise you. It's several things we've talked about on this channel before: supernatural horror, the inherent oneness of the Afro-musical diaspora, the centrality of black music to American life, the impasse between the secular and the religious, and musing on the black condition. It's like all the stuff I like. And yeah, the movie's set in the 30s, but everybody knows that period pieces aren't really about the time that they're set in. Not nearly so much as the time they were made in. Now, before we get into it, I want to address comments I've received in the past about being mad that I'm talking about race, saying that they didn't come here for all that, even though I had Black History Month right in the thumbnail. And to those people, I have to ask, what exactly did you come here for? I'm getting pretty tired of everybody acting like race and ethnicity are these dangerous political minefields to be maneuvered, instead of just a normally part of the wonderfully diverse cultural identities of everybody all over the world. Culture's been so weaponized as this thing to divide us that many people forget it should be something to celebrate, which this movie does. At its core, strip away everything else, the period piece drama trappings, the horror elements. This is a movie about the blues. The movie opens by talking about special people who are blessed with an ability to make music so pure it can pierce the veil between our world and the next. And not just how revered of an ability that is, but how universal too. And then we liken blues musicians to Native American firekeepers or even African griots. Something we've talked about on this channel before. I feel like I'm going to be saying that phrase a lot tonight. Music as a conduit for spiritual and metaphysical experiences is very old and very cross-cultural. The opening narration also introduces the idea that this power can call on both good and evil, which of course hints at the main plot of vampires descending on the juke joint after they hear the music, but also on a real-world level, the co-opting of the blues, and by extension Black American music, by white folks. If you've been around the channel, this isn't even the first time you've heard me say that exact phrase. Our main character, Sammy, otherwise known as Preacher Boy, is torn between his perceived responsibilities to his father, a devoutly Christian preacher, and the allure and freedom of playing the blues in secular spaces, as represented by his cousins, the powerful and cool yet flawed Smokestack twins. And this too plays into the movie's opening idea about powerful music being able to call on both good and bad. I've spoken about it on this channel before, but being black often means having to negotiate the line between secularism and spiritualism, not as a matter of choice, but as a necessary byproduct of how deeply ingrained religion is at all levels of Black American culture. And at perhaps no other level of the culture do we see that negotiation more explicitly than with the blues. Let me explain why. Brief history lesson: if we go way back to some of the earliest music in the Western canon, the primary difference between religious and secular music, even back then, was lyrical content. Go back a little further and you'll find that some societies didn't feel instrumental music was worth it or even morally acceptable outside of a religious context. And it's funny how similar black culture in the early 20th century was. Now, what I'm about to say should be pretty evident for anybody who's familiar with gospel and the blues, but even though the lyrical content of these two genres was very different, they both came from the exact same place: the spiritual. Spirituals are very special, forged of a mutual connection of suffering and borrowing from sounds all up and down the African West Coast, molded and shaped by the unimaginably terrible experiences the kidnapped endured both on the journey to America and actually being here. Now, spirituals were a lot of different things: hope and prayer for a better tomorrow or a promised land, rallying songs to keep from keeling over and literally dying, coded messages to communicate, basically whatever the enslaved needed them to be in order to survive. Now, in addition to prayers and pleas for God's help, many spirituals were also just retellings of biblical stories. And so in black churches and congregations, which were the first spaces we had to ourselves in this country, hence the centrality of the black church to the community, the music pretty much translated directly, like one-to-one. Yeah, over the years we'd add instruments like organ and piano and drums, but at the core of everything that goes on in the black church today, and indeed black music on the whole, you've got spirituals, and by extension, the blues. Thus, the spiritual is the single purest, most distilled form of black American music that there is. Knowing this context is crucial to examining and breaking down how this movie uses music to make its points. And I want to start with arguably the bluesiest character in the movie, the alcoholic pianist Delta Slim, played by the incomparable Delroy Lindo. Seriously, this dude is one of the few actors where I'll go see a movie just because he's in it. Now, Lindo himself said in interviews that he viewed the movie as an investigation of what happens when community is infiltrated. And the movie uses the blues as the primary way of exploring that concise yet accurate description comprehensively. In the very first scene with Slim, he scoffs at the idea that Sammy could be a great blues musician. He says to him, "I got socks older than you. What the hell you know about playing the blues?" A flippant remark from the old head to the young upstart horning in on his territory, but it also reflects the history of the blues as a product of and a musing on all the terrible shit that had happened and was still happening at that time in America. We call it the blues for a reason. In contrast to the social functionality of spirituals and gospel, music that was made to forge a community, the blues was more introspective, less about what was going on with the community and more about what was happening with you. In a broader sense, you could also think of this as the collective black consciousness transitioning from the more Afrocentric perspective of I am because we are, to the more Eurocentric perspective of I think, therefore I am, reflecting a westernization of African ideals. We could also start talking about Du Bois's ideas on double consciousness, but this is a whole other topic for a whole other video. The point is, Delta Slim has been around. If we take him to be Lindo's actual age of 72, and we take the year that the film is set in, 1932, it's very possible or even likely that Slim was born into slavery or to recently freed slaves at best. He would have been around to see not just the birth of the blues, but the full scope of the horrors that created it. And speaking of horrors, let's look at a scene I feel like not enough people talk about. Slim, Stack, and Sammy are all driving in a car to go pick up cornbread, and on the way they pass by a chain gang, all of whom Slim knows. He proceeds to tell a story about how, under threat of jail, he and some friends formed a traveling blues group at the behest of some white folks. And they turned a decent profit doing it. But then that profit got Slim's friend wrongfully accused, lynched, and castrated. He warns Sammy that white folks like the blues, just not so much the people who make it. And if you've been around this channel, or if you're an avid scholar of American music history, this is probably very obvious. But this is an extremely explicit commentary and allegory for the American music scene. And the main conflict of the movie's second half drives that home further. Now, I feel like every time I or anybody talks about this topic, there's some misinterpretation, so let me clear this up. Talking about co-opting is not an attack on current white musicians. I'm not saying that they're worse, or that I don't enjoy their music, or that I think they're wrong for making it. All we're doing right now is talking about history, yeah? And if talking about history feels like an attack on you personally, it's not, but you should probably examine why that is. Now again, I've already done some videos diving pretty deep into this topic, so check those out if you want to know more. But the short version is, the co-opting of black American music by white folks is as old as black American music itself. And the movie plays with this idea in very cool, creative, and graphic fashion, with the elder Irish vampire Remick attempting to co-opt Sammy's talents for his own benefit. Although it's worth noting, Remick wasn't doing this out of racism. Dozens of articles and video essays already exist on the complexity of this character, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But Remick is old enough to remember the occupation of his homeland and to have been discriminated against himself. But he still chooses to put himself in an unfair position over these people he feels this kinship with. And even though he genuinely believes he's helping them, he still becomes an oppressor in his own right. But my big point is that Slim sits at the crossroads of this movie's big themes. The potential of good or evil to come of powerful music, as Slim brings joy to people every night, but he's an alcoholic and it's implied he's done some bad shit. But he's also the most representative character of the power of blues to heal, to reflect, to mourn, and later in the film, to conjure. When Slim reaches the end of his story, he understandably gets overwhelmed with emotion, and his grunts of pain gradually turn into a sound we immediately recognize as the blues, making it explicit to everyone in the audience that this music is an expression of that pain. How do we know it's the blues? Can we analyze that? Yes, and we will later. Stack suggests that Sammy play along with him, but he hesitates, and on first watch I didn't really understand why. I still don't fully, but here's my interpretation. This is Sammy's first experience with somebody directly in touch with the original, first-hand, undiluted source of the blues. The hesitation wasn't fear, it was reverence. Reverence at the relating of an experience so utterly soaked in why the blues exist in the first place. In the universe of the film, Slim is as authentic a blues musician as could possibly exist. On first watch, I clocked Slim as just like a comic relief side character, but on second watch, to me, he's like the most important character in the movie next to Sammy in terms of the film's main ideas about the blues, as well as something of a foil to Sammy's youth and naivete. And no, I'm not just saying all this because I'm a huge Delroy Lindo fan. So with that bit of preamble, talking about the discourse the movie sets up around the blues and the characters it uses to do it, let's get into one of the movie's most central thematic scenes and probably everybody's favorite scene. Sammy's performance of his original song, called I Lied to You in the movie's official soundtrack. Now remember, the movie specifies that in order to conjure the spirits, the music has to be pure. And as we've discussed, the blues is all about saying what's going on with you. And Sammy's song is entirely about his main conflict, religion versus secularism. Thus, it isn't just the blues aesthetic he's adopted here, he's actually telling us what's on his mind and his heart. And coupled with Slim's playing, the two of them successfully pierce the veil and invite in all manner of spirits, which we'll talk about them later. But I want to give some attention to the brief lesson that Slim gives Sammy before the summoning. We assume it was given at some point before the juke joint opened, but we're shown it right before the summoning begins and the tone shifts. In very stark contrast to his role throughout the rest of the film, here Slim takes on more of a mentor persona, saying that the blues is unique because we brought this with us. It's such a simple exchange, but one that gives me goosebumps just to even think about, because just think of the implications of what that means. Think about the nightmares our people went through just to keep that music alive, what that music means, the circumstances it represents. From pain, art. And that is us. That is the culture. And as Slim explains, there's magic in what we do. And as this ghostly choir rises in the background, we hear the flickering and flitting of ancient taps and plucks. Ghosts from different lands and times flock to familiar sounds. It's spooky, but it's comforting. It's ominous, yet it's beautiful. It was easily the most moved I had ever been watching something on screen, but if you know what we're about here at Team Real New, that shouldn't surprise you. Now let's get into some analysis. Fair warning, I'm going to get a little technical here, so if that's not your thing, you can click off the video guilt-free. My feelings won't be hurt. Well, maybe a little. But try sticking with me for a little bit, because I'm going to use my most tried and true tool for explaining musical shit. Here.
Live demonstration. Friends, it may not surprise you to learn that I myself am known to play some blues piano from time to time, and just to get us warmed up, here's a little boogie woogie for y'all. If this sounds familiar, it's because this was the specific style of blues playing that Slim was doing by himself earlier in the night. And this was a style you'd have commonly heard in that decade from solo pianists in the South, although in the North you'd more likely have heard stride during that time. Even the word boogie itself is thought to have origins among Mandinka and Bantu peoples, another diaspora connection. So if you don't know anything about the blues, get ready to learn. You might remember me saying earlier that you can analyze the blues, and there's two components that we look at to do that. I'll start with the easier one first, which is form. Now, you don't have to be a music theorist to know what form is. If you can identify the verse, chorus, or bridge of your favorite songs, then congratulations, you know form. It basically just refers to what parts of a song repeat and when. Now, back in the day, form was oftentimes a little simpler than it is now, especially with the blues. It was basically just one section repeated over and over with different lyrics. No bridge, no chorus, nothing. Now again, repetition and call and response have always been extremely important in African music, and this carried over into the blues with a statement of idea, a restatement of that idea, and then usually some kind of response or resolution. You can even see the same thing in the lyrics of spirituals. Now here's the thing, form is not always going to tell us when we can characterize something as the blues. In fact, the idea of the blues form itself was codified and formalized in cities, but this thing that we call the blues existed before that. Not to mention, almost none of the blues in this movie is the formalized, academically correct version of the blues. So if we can't clock it off form, how can we? Well, this is where we gotta get into some light music theory. I know, but it'll be fun, trust me. So let's talk about pentatonics. No, not those pentatonics. Now, nearly every single culture everywhere in the world has made music based on certain collections of notes that we call scales. And there's tons of different scales out there, but the one that we're focusing on is one of the oldest and most universal in the world. In many cases, originating independently in locations thousands of miles apart. Kind of spooky, huh? Makes you think maybe there is some magic in these old keys after all. Now, the piano actually has your pentatonic sound labeled in a way, and that's right here. Your black keys. Now, there's two ways that the pentatonic scale can appear. We've got the major one, and we've got our minor one. Now, for the purposes of what we're talking about here, we're going to focus on our minor one, because that's the one that gets used in the movie. Let's say I take this pentatonic scale, I play this pattern. Now let's say I shift all of those keys down. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that's the main riff that Sammy hums during I Lied to You. And the other patterns in the song are pentatonic as well, right? Now, our pentatonic scale is almost the blues, but not quite. There's one note that we got to add to it. This one here. Now we've got what we call a blues scale. You'll hear some people describe this additional note as the blue note. And that's accurate in more ways than one. That is the note that we added to the pentatonics here in this country to make it the blues. How did it get added? Well, when we talk about being expressive vocally, bends and moans and wails and all that kind of stuff have been a natural part of human expression forever. Doesn't take much for to become. Now, I'm willing to bet that even if you're not a musician or a hardcore blues fan, this probably sounds familiar to you. And that's because, in the words of one of my professors, everything in this country is the blues. All of it, all our music, this is where it's rooted, this is where it comes from. Finally, the blues also uses specific chords. Now, when we combine notes together at the same time like this, we get chords. Now, there's as many chords out there as there are scales, but for the blues, we really only need to remember 3 of them. The ones starting with the first, third, and fourth notes of our pentatonic scale. Although if we count the note that we skip, we would count these 4 and 5, which is more standard in music theory. So broadly, our chord form goes 1 to 4, back to 1, to 5. Depending on where you are, you might hear another 4 here, and then back to 1. Put it all together. And you got the blues. So when Slim and Sammy play the blues and it conjures all these spirits from the past and the future, in the context of the movie, they are summoning actual spirits. But it's also the music that connects us to what was taken from us and what we were taken from. Not just in terms of lyrical content, but also in that this sound, the blues, the pentatonics, this one sound links all the different cultures and eras that we see in this scene. Now, Bjornsson himself, who is no stranger to using indigenous percussion in more contemporary concert settings to illustrate the intermixing of aesthetics and eras, really outdid himself here. When the veil is pierced, as I mentioned earlier, other voices join in with the humming, which is easily interpreted as a ghostly choir comprised of the ancestors, especially given the gospel nature of the sound, as well as a plucked string instrument, which the track listing says is an early banjo, but in the context of the scene is being played by what we can assume to be the spirit of a griot, and so is actually probably more likely something closer to a kota or a zither. Now I want to give special attention to this, not just because this is the first spirit we prominently see, but also because African plucked string instruments are the precursors to the banjo. The banjo being the central instrument of American folk music, which was originally made by, you guessed it, black people. Don't believe me? There's always someone who doesn't. Look it up. Next, we get a very colorful guitarist who isn't supposed to be anybody specific, but is representative of black rock and roll and fusion guitarists from the 60s and 70s like Jimi Hendrix, Eddie Hazel, and Cordell Mossel. Now again, if you've been on this channel, you know how bad a rep this period in music history sometimes gets. And you also know how strongly I feel about it deserving better. So for me, seeing this dude pop up was mind-blowing. Not just for the inclusion of the genre, but as a visual representation of the direct musical and instrumental connections from Africa. From coda to banjo to electric guitar, from drum circles to the blues to rock and fusion. Also, listen more specifically to what each of these dudes are playing. Here's Sammy's riff, for example. Here's what the griot was playing. Now I add in a little bit of Slim's flair. And even if we were to rip an electric guitar solo over that. Different flavors, different sounds, different eras, different tones, but it's all still the blues, right? From throughout time, from throughout space, this is what connects us. How couldn't you think this is cool? A DJ's turntables segue us into the next segment, which is beyond clever because what follows is basically a sampling of different time period sounds, all overlaid onto the main ongoing riff of Sammy's song. Now, DJs are well known for being able to mix and match songs, overlaying different elements and creating something brand new from stuff we've heard 1,000 times before. And not only is that exactly what's going on in the soundtrack at this part, like the soundtrack itself is being DJ'd through all these different eras, but it also relates to the creation of great music on a larger scale, where different styles blend together to create totally new genres. For example, ragtime and Latin influences blending together in Creole country to birth the earliest form of jazz. Yet another way contemporary black art forms are connected to older styles they seem to have nothing in common with. And we passed through a few different periods, notably East Coast hip-hop of the 80s, West Coast hip-hop of the 90s, more contemporary styles of trap and dance music, a Zauli dancer, an insanely cool art form originating from the Garo people of the Ivory Coast, one of the primary regions we were taken from. And also, if you're a Zelda fan, I bet that sounds familiar to you. And even a Sichu performer, representing a very old school of Chinese musical theater, called there just because of the presence of Grace and Bo, which I thought was a really cool detail because it's like you don't necessarily have to be black to benefit from this ancestral connection, right? And taking full advantage of the sampling premise, we also get a parallel drawn between modern and traditional syncopation. For those who don't know, syncopation just means emphasizing things off the beat. It's one of the big things we carried here through spirituals, and even if you listen to the most basic spirituals possible, you're going to hear a lot of syncopation in them. And what's done with it here is so subtle, but very, very cool. So here we got the DJ's 808s, right? And let me turn off all the other stuff so we can isolate that and hear how that happens. So here's the 808s. Now these rhythms are happening in what we would typically call in music quadruplets, which means groups of 4. Now everything we've been hearing so far has been happening in what we call music triplets, or groups of 3. Now putting them together, we get something really cool in the movie, right? We get this. In music, we call this a hemiola, which is just a fancy word for when we have two different types of rhythm groups sitting on top of one another. Now, in the context of this scene, we get this hemiola in between the present music, which is the blues of the 1930s, and the future music, which is the hip-hop of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, right? Now, coming out of that section and into the part where the Zauli dancer shows up, we get something that sounds a little bit more like this.
And here's what's cool about this. Even though there's a hard and drastic change of instrumentation here, we've still got a couple hemiolas going on, right? In that main rhythmic percussion figure, we've got a group of 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then a group of 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And you put them together, that's where you get that sound from that's in the percussion there, right? Then we've got another layer of hemiola going on. Our original blues group is in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. But then this new figure we're probably feeling in 3, right? Either a fast 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or a slow 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So this part, we've got hemiolas on hemiolas happening here, right? And in doing this, the audience is made to engage with the parallels between syncopation of more modern styles of black music and how it's existed for a long time. Syncopation is not new, right? And by weaving all the stuff that we've talked about together into this 5 minutes, we're given a much more fun and succinct crash course on how similar all this music really is than what I just gave us here.
And besides the amazing camera work, the great costuming, the incredible scoring, and the scene overall just being amazing, it's also, like I mentioned with the guitarists earlier, the best visual representation of the Afro-musical diaspora I've ever seen in my life. Breakers are presented alongside the Zaoli dancer. Twerking is shown to be a very old expression of dance performed by women thousands of years apart. And in these 5 minutes, you're really made to feel like you're witnessing the entire diaspora expanse of artistic tradition compressed into this one little room. It's exactly like when Aang was looking down the line at all the past avatars. I was just as moved, maybe even more so the second time I saw it, and I'm sure I'm going to be just as moved when I go to see it a third time this weekend. There's DNA tests now, yeah, but for a long time, and maybe even still now depending on your financial situation, the majority of black folks have no idea what their ancestry is. What country or region we hail from, what language our ancestors spoke, nothing. All we have are spirituals and the blues and the musical styles tied to them. But like Slim said, and like this immaculate scene illustrates, we brought that with us. So this concludes my big analysis of how the blues are used as the central crux to explore the movie's themes. I also thought it might be fun to do a deep dive on Ludwig's process, some of the personnel on the soundtrack, because he called up a lot of legit people to write the soundtrack with him. So depending on how this video does, I might do a follow-up, we'll see. But for now, this has already gone on longer than my videos usually do, so thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one. Go see Sinners again. Peace.